If you like small town mystery, crazy news, and wild history, then the Florida Men on Florida Man podcast is for you. Each week, Josh Mills and Wayne McCarty bring you the absolute best Florida has to offer. So if you're looking for a show that's safe for the family, but funny enough to help you escape everyday life, then listen to the Florida Men on Florida Man podcast. That's Florida Men, plural, on Florida Man podcast.
You do have to hold space for someone else's trauma, and you do have to protect yourself from that without ending up being not empathetic.
You have
to
to
it.
put
So
you have to put your gloves on.
you have to put your gloves on, yeah.
Welcome to Psychocinemaniacs, a podcast where we analyse depictions of mental illness and disability in popular films and TV. I'm your host, Stephanie Fornasia. If you love our podcast and want to give us some support, make sure you're following Psychocinematic Podcast on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. And check out our website, psychocinematicpodcast.com, for access to special bonus content, episodes, early access, stickers, and contribute to our regular fundraisers. Join our Patreon. Starting from $3.50 a month, you can be the coolest psychocinematic listener there is. Please note that this episode contains discussions of suicide and self-harm. If this episode brings up anything for you, Lifeline is available on 131114 or the suicide callback service on 1300 659 467. But feel free to skip this one if you prefer.
So I'd like to start the podcast recording today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which I'm on today, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And just a little Australia-based note, even though the majority of our nation voted no for some recognition in the Constitution for First Nation peoples, myself and other allies are still very much on the side of First Nations people and acknowledge them as deserving of voice. So I just wanted to throw that in there because the last podcast episode I said, let's all vote yes. But anyway, all that aside, I'd love to introduce the co-hosts we have today from the BraaaAAINS podcast, which is Sarah and Heather Taylor. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you both?
Oh, great. Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us. I want to just shout out that I'm joining in from Treaty 6 territory, the home of the Nehewa, Cree, Dene, Solatu, and on and on. Anyway, I just want to acknowledge that.
Thank you so much. Would you ladies like to introduce yourself to our podcast listeners? Heather, would you like to start?
Of course. I'd always love to start. I was going to say there is, again, just like Sarah, there is where I am in Manhattan. So I had to look this up because I normally am in Toronto, but in Manhattan, so the ancestral homelands of the Canarsie, Munsee Lenape, and the Wappinger people. So I just wanted to throw that up there because I'm in New York City right now.
Fabulous.
I am Heather Taylor. I am a writer and a director. I write TV and films and podcasts about complicated family relationships, often through a genre lens, which is why I'm so excited about today. I was a story editor on The Hardy Boys. I obviously co-host BraaaAINS with my amazing sister, Sarah. And it's a podcast about how film and TV portray our brains. And so it feels like a very much a sister podcast to this podcast, which I'm so excited about. And my second feature lives on Netflix. It's called Lethal Love. I think it's actually in Australia.
Yay! Oh, good.
Not in Canada. It's fun. It's just good for, as I was told by the producer, good with a glass of wine. And then I started out as a playwright. I've authored 3 poetry collections, and I'm a former journalist and ad person. And I was born with a non-visible disability. I have ADHD, and I strive to destigmatize mental illness, disabilities, and poverty in my work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And just like you say, I feel like BraaaAINS and Psychocinematic are 2 peas in a podcast. So it's so great to have you on. Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Yes, of course. So I am the sister of Heather, as she mentioned. I can officially say I'm Sarah Taylor CCE. I just got my accreditation for editing, so it's very exciting. I am an award-winning editor with over 20 years of experience in documentaries, television programs, like all the things you can think of I've cut. But I always strive to tell unique stories from unheard voices, which is also what we do with our podcast. So I both co-host the podcast BraaaAINS with Heather, and I also host an editing podcast called The Editor's Cut. So all I'd like to do is talk about BraaaAINS, I talk about editing, and I edit. That is my life. And I'm very pleased to do all those
It
things.
must be an extremely busy life, because as someone who's only fully edited Psychocinematic in the last few months, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, I'm
It definitely
busy,
takes
but-
time. Tell everyone what CCE means, because not everyone
yes.
will know what that is.
Yes, please.
So CCE stands for Canadian Cinema Editors. It's an organization that promotes and supports editing in Canada. So if you look at end credits and you see anybody that has an ACE, there's also an Australian version of it, which also might be ACE. I'm not sure what the letters are in there, but they definitely have one. It just tells you that you are
An
the
awesome
highest
editor.
highest
Yeah.
editor in the country, kind of thing, which feels
The best
weird to
editor
say.
you could be.
But I just got my letters and it's very exciting, and this is the first time I get to say it out loud. So yay!
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's awesome. I want to know, which is the older sister?
I'm the oldest sister, Heather. Yeah, I'm the
Okay.
oldest.
I feel like that's relevant to what we talk about today.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
So when I suggested you guys come on the podcast, we were talking about what we should cover, and you pretty much immediately suggested this piece of media, which is Haunting of Hill House. And I was so stoked. What made you both decide pretty much unanimously to choose this to focus on today?
I just thought it was a brilliant series, and it scared the bejesus out of me. And I liked how there was more than just like the jump scares. There's more to the story than just being scared. So when we were talking about like spooky shows to do around Halloween, it just made sense to talk about this.
For me, I'm a huge fan of Mike Flanagan's work. It's kind of not only the type of horror that I both enjoy and actually scares me. I find like I could watch a slasher film and feel essentially nothing. But if you have emotional depth to characters like he does, and this kind of emotional connection, I found sometimes in, let's say, Haunting of Hill House, I was more scared and upset by some of the emotional moments than I was in some of the scares from the ghosts. But I think it's because he really creates a world not just where you have to beat the bad guy, but you actually have to grapple with whatever metaphor that he's put forward. So like Haunting Hill House is ghosts, but it's really about something internal within the characters. And so I love and how he plays with past and present. He does it in everything. Because this belief that he says this himself, this idea of giving weight to their past trauma on their current selves, because our past does affect our future or our present. And I found a quote from him. He said, "I really wanted to play with ghosts as an expression of the emotional wounds that we carry, how the past and present can echo each other, that moments don't fall like dominoes, they fall like confetti."
I love that. Yeah. For me, I absolutely love his series, but it took me a while to recognize how good they were, because they're so brilliantly made and so incredible, but they also make me feel awful because he does it so well. So like the first time I watched this, I thought it took itself a bit too seriously and the acting was a little bit over the top and I wasn't as invested in it. But on the second watch of Haunting of Hill House, I was just like, this is like the best show ever made, especially because it was, like you're saying, it's so much of a meditation on grief and trauma and how the past and present intermingle and how you have to grapple with your own demons. But also it's so campy at the same time. It does it in a way that is a little bit ridiculous, which makes it a good setting to explore those things in a way where it makes you feel terrible, but also you can exit out of it a little bit and like this, you know, this isn't reality. But like Midnight Mass, I think I love Midnight Mass the most because it just really affected me the most and it like gave me a panic attack at one point. No. But Haunting of Hill House was close. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought it up because there's a lot of grief in it and what's going on in my family at the moment involves a lot of grief, so it's actually really relevant. But yeah, there's so much to explore. There's so much to unpack in this show, so I feel like it's going to be a very rich discussion.
Yeah, and I'll just shout out, Midnight Mass was his most personal work. So he said like he's been trying to write Midnight Mass for years and it took him becoming sober to be able to actually write about something that talks about alcoholism. He's like, I could talk about alcoholism, but I couldn't talk about sobriety. And now once being sober, it allowed me to be able to actually talk about this. So he's like, if someone asked me to write this in 2014, I wouldn't have been able to write it or do it. I had to wait until I'd been sober. But he actually references Midnight Mass in other films before Midnight Mass was even made. He has as a novel in Gerald's Game.
The Stephen King adaptation.
Stephen King.
Yeah.
Midnight Mass, the novel, is in that film.
Oh, wow.
So like he'd been obsessed with this idea of this since he was he started thinking about this since he was 10 years old and an altar boy when he lived on Governor's Island, which is really isolated, small community. So
Wow. That's so interesting.
I want to watch it again now that I don't drink. Because I feel like I watched Midnight Mass when I was drinking. And I think it would be a different perspective.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a side note.
that's a different show, but
I know.
like
But
no,
yeah,
but like
interesting.
there's the character that kills someone
Well, yeah.
when he's drunk, but that was his biggest fear.
Yeah.
And so he put that to play, which is, I think, a lot of times, I know I put my biggest fears into stuff all the time.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like for me, Midnight Mass was very much about the afterlife and death and continuing on, which is one of my biggest anxiety triggers. So exploring that, I'm sure that he's probably got a lot of his own fears wrapped up in that as well.
Yeah.
And it was very relatable in that way. But on Haunted Hill House, I guess the other thing is he tends to adapt a lot from like famous authors. So Haunting of Hill House was based on the book by Shirley Jackson, which was known as one of the most terrifying ghost stories ever written. And he also did Haunting of Bly Manor, which is based on Turn of the Screw by Henry James, I think.
Yes, it's Henry James, yes.
And then the latest one, The House of Usher, is also based on an Edgar Allan Poe poem, I'm guessing. I haven't read it.
It's a book. Yeah. He's just very poetic. So we've only just started watching because I wanted to watch Hill House versus the Fall of the House of Usher.
Same. I haven't started it yet because I thought I'd get confused.
In the pilot, you have actually so much of Poe's original language that I was like, oh my goodness, like it's so cool to hear those words, but in a kind of very contemporary context. So I thought, oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, so he's very much like and adapts things to a point where it's more relatable to right now, but also is much more than the novel. Have you read The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, the book?
No, I haven't actually.
I started listening to the audiobook, but I didn't get through it.
Good idea. Oh, okay.
But it seems quite different. There's only really a few of the characters that are present in the TV show. Eleanor, Theodora, and Luke are the characters who are in the house, but they aren't related at all. And the Dudleys are also there. But other than that, a lot of like the themes are the same, but the actual plot is quite different, it seems.
Oh, interesting. Well, but that's the thing is that he's using these as a jumping off point, right?
Yes.
Like thematically, but then also like great on him for finding IP.
Yeah, no kidding.
That is like open. I think it's all public domain. So he's like, I'm going to take this public domain and talk about stuff I want to talk about, but interconnect it with something that is known and then make it even more known. Yeah. So I'm like, good on you, Mike Flanagan.
It's a good way to do it. Yeah.
Super smart.
I'll just briefly discuss the plot and I'll just make it very open-ended because otherwise we'll be here for hours. Yes. So the summer of 1992, Hugh and Olivia Crane and their 5 children, Stephen, Shirley, Theo or Theodora, Luke and Eleanor or Nell, move into Hill House to renovate the mansion in order to sell it and build their own forever home, designed by Olivia. However, due to unexpected repairs, they have to stay longer and they begin to experience increasing paranormal phenomena, resulting in a tragic loss and the family fleeing from the house. 26 years later, the Crane siblings and their estranged father reunite after another tragedy strikes, and they are forced to confront how their time in Hill House has affected each of them. If you haven't watched Haunting of Hill House, definitely watch it before you listen to this episode. But there's going to be lots of spoilers, but yes. There's lots to unpack. And I guess one thing that I think it was a review said, it's not so much a paranormal story as so much as a meditation on the distinct way grief and trauma maim the living, as we've sort of alluded to. I looked up some lived experience of the creators, and you both sort of had a lot to say about Mike Flanagan. Do you want to share a little bit more about what you found out?
Yeah, I think that from what I looked at, growing up, his family relocated a lot because his dad was in the Coast Guard. So they basically moved around all over the place until he was in high school. So to me, like the Haunting of Hill House, this family who moves from place to place, renovating houses, like flipping houses, I'm like, that's so reflective of not really having a home and your family being the only tether is like with each other, and the importance that comes with that movement. And then also, like I was reading, like, and I you can see in his stuff, his core themes are domestic abuse, alcoholism, addiction, and then battling mental illness or dealing with mental illness. I don't like to say battling.
Yeah.
But that's language from someone else. he said directly, the Haunting Hill House is infused with his experiences with death in his extended family and includes specific imagery from his life. And he also said there's a very natural thing that happens where if you're writing anything that tiptoes into a personal place, you find yourself vomiting up all sorts of things into it. It happened to me with Hill House in a pretty big way. So I couldn't find, he just lets, most of his work is inspired by his experiences of his life, but I couldn't find him ever talking directly about these things. But with its prevalence in so much of his work, I feel like most of this is deeply personal.
Yeah, I think we could probably determine what's some of the traumas that he's experienced in his life. And it's interesting you mentioned domestic abuse, because I feel like in a lot of his media, there's a lot of like coercive control or query, is this actually a good marriage, or are there some sort of dynamics that are toxic and things like that inside them? And not just marriage, but also in relationships in general. Sarah, did you have anything to add?
Just like I watched a few things where he talked about being like a showrunner and how he like directs things and the use of camera, and like I just found it interesting how there's a I feel like he has a meaning to everything he puts out there. Like there's a purpose for all the things he chooses to do, and I found
it's all very deliberate.
Yeah, he's very deliberate in his way of filmmaking, and I thought the music, like all the choices he makes, and it works really well, especially the camera.
He's an editor. You know this, Sarah, right?
I didn't know that. No.
He's an editor first. He actually
Which then that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
now I know why.
He films by the edit. So he actually edited reality TV, including second season of Drag Race.
Oh my God,
so
really?
I should know this. I should interview him for my other podcast.
Wow.
And
second season of Drag Race is when like the first season's kind of a write-off. So
when the things
of editing.
That makes total sense.
Yeah. He thinks about the edit.
And how he uses the camera in a way that really motivates the edit, because often I found like I was really impressed with watching the series. I'm taking it on an editing side note now, because there wasn't often like there's one scene where there's no real like visual edits. It's all like one quote unquote take. It's not, but it is. And so like it's just so well done on that side of things, and that storytelling is amazing.
Yeah.
A lot of it was. I talked to a camera guy who actually operated on it, but they hand off camera to people.
Yeah.
I think
there was
a few cuts.
I don't know if I read that. There was a few secret, like you hide the cuts in action, but yeah.
Yeah, but there was like them going from the funeral home into the house was actually in studio. So it actually was that. They walked through into the house and it was that was actual.
That was one of the best episodes.
I watched it behind the scenes. So cool.
And they had like a lift where the camera stepped on, like the camera operator stepped onto the lift, and then it lowered. So it looked like the camera was on a giant crane, but it was on a lift they built in and then lowered it to the ground, and then they kept walking. And they would. I think
there is a behind the scenes somewhere that you can see how the operators worked. Anyway, so many really great filmmaking techniques that he applies.
If you do find the behind the scenes, send it to me so I can pop it in the episode notes, because that would be great to see. And it really shows that, because I feel like editors don't get as much recognition as like the directors and writers, etc. It just highlights how important editing is to telling the story and how it can be used in such an effective way.
Especially this genre.
Yes. It's all about the edits. Yeah. Oh, thank you. That's so interesting. I did a little bit of a deep dive into Shirley Jackson because I find her really fascinating. And I don't know if you've seen the film Shirley, starring Elizabeth Moss, who plays Shirley Jackson.
Ooh.
It's sort of a fictionalized version movie about sort of her later life, and which is true, when she was a bit old, I think sort of in her 60s, she had some pretty severe agoraphobia and anxiety, and sort of self-medicated with alcohol and drugs. And at the time she wasn't able to write. She had writer's block, and she also had quite a philandering husband who would just very openly have affairs with students at the university where he taught. So yeah, she had a pretty rough time. And there's this movie which is kind of about that time. It's not a particularly great movie. I was a bit disappointed by it when I finally watched it, but Elizabeth Moss does an amazing job. So, if people want to watch it, go ahead. But yeah, it was interesting hearing Shirley Jackson's sort of experience of mental illness herself, which I think, having not read the full original book, but there's definitely some themes of mental illness within that as well. And she explains that she had a very conservative family and parents who weren't particularly nice to her. Her mum really was undermining and demeaning and quite abusive towards her, and she described herself as an outsider. She felt really lonely growing up. She would write about how the only sane people are the ones who are condemned as mad, that's as in her words, and how the whole world is cruel and afraid of people who are different.
Yes.
So I think that really shines through in what I know of her novels. The only other piece of work that I've read is The Lottery.
Yeah, I read that at school.
Pretty iconic. Yeah, it's often prescribed to students to read. I think we just read it during lockdown when we had a short story book club to get us through.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, it was good. Everyone should read The Lottery. It's very relevant to today, I think. I won't spoil it. But I think she's pretty much held up as a very interesting author with a lot to say about society, a lot to say about mental illness and about being a woman as well, and being a wife, which is something that she sort of found herself being and not really particularly having a lot of control over that role. This quote was interesting. She said, "I wrote of neuroses and fear, and I think all of my books laid end to end would be one long documentation of anxiety."
I can agree with, well, maybe not all of her, but with this show, yes.
Yeah. 100%. Apparently she died mentally quite well. She died in her sleep of a heart attack. And she was in a pretty good place, and she was in the middle of writing her last novel. So I'm comforted to know that she was not struggling with a lot of mental neuroses that she had. But yeah, I just find it really interesting just based on the content that she wrote about.
Yeah. And that they become so much part of our world as well. Right.
Yeah, especially given like this novel, Haunting of Hill House, was made into a film
twice.
A couple of films.
Yeah, twice.
Yeah, twice. The Haunting and The Haunting of Hill House. Yeah, like you say, her work is quite timeless.
Yeah, totally.
So the actors, I had a look through at all the different actors and any sort of lived experience that they had. Did you guys manage to have a look as well?
Well, I looked at your list. I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of stuff going on with them too. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. I'll just maybe mention the ones where there was some information, because not everyone, and some of them are quite new actors, although most of them appear in all of Mike Flanagan's works, which is great.
It's really fun.
It's really cool. And I even noticed in the new series, the mom, right?
Yes.
Isn't it? And I was
tons of them are. Tons of the
I love that part. Anyway, yes. So
yeah, I love an ensemble.
I want to say, when you see the same crew and the same actors working with a director, you know they're good. Like not just they're good at their job, they are good people to work with.
Good
Yes.
humans,
good humans. So
they want to keep working with each other.
Yeah.
I love that.
Especially when the crew sticks around. That's like a really good sign. I think as a crew member, a very good sign.
Just a side note, I love the Newton brothers. Just a shout out to the composers of all of Mike Flanagan's work and a few other things too. But I follow them on Twitter. I listen to their stuff whenever I'm writing. I like every time I'm like shouting them, I'm like, listen to your stuff today. And they're like, way to go. And I'm like totally in love with them. I'm like, I want them to be the musicians, composers for my horror feature that I want to do soon. So I'm like, if you're listening, Newton Brothers, just know I'm coming for you.
Well, that you're listening to them while you're writing your spooky show, your scary shows.
Yeah,
I think that's
literally,
so,
yeah.
I love it.
And not spooky shows too. I was listening to the House of Usher while I was writing a family drama set in the music industry. So.
Which has its own horror elements.
Exactly.
I
think your themes play through everything, Heather. There's always something a little scary.
Yes.
Brilliant. Yeah, but unfortunately, I didn't kind of look up the crew because, yeah.
I don't know what their lived experience is.
There wasn't
I
much.
just love them.
Exactly. I'm sure they don't get interviewed as often as these guys. But just a few things. Carla Gugino as Olivia Crane, the matriarch, has had some early trauma in her life. She had a kidney surgery at 5 years old and led to a near-death experience. So, yeah, that's all I could find, but I'm sure that has definitely shaped some of her work. And she's quite established in she was in Spy Kids. I just realized that the other day. I'm like,
she's a mom.
Spy Kids.
She's the mom, mom.
Which is funny because she's not actually as old as I thought she was. She just kind of plays that really maternal. She just has that maternal sort of look about her. Timothy Hutton, who plays Hugh, the older Hugh, sadly, not great news, but there was a sexual assault accusation, which he was faced no charge from. But, you know, that doesn't sound great. Anyway, that's not relevant to what we're talking about, but I just thought it's worth mentioning.
Yeah.
Henry Thomas was the younger Hugh Crane, and he was the young boy in E.T., which is wild to me. He's a fantastic actor, but obviously given that he was exposed to fame quite early on, that was a lot for him, and he was very conscious of not wanting to be, you know, the child actor that goes off the rails. He has had some alcohol issues in his past, was arrested for drunk driving, and also is a quite avid mental health advocate. Yeah, he was lucky in that he wasn't one of the, you know, like Corey Haim sort of in the news everywhere as being really struggling with fame as he grew up.
I feel like he went away. Like he took himself out of Hollywood. And was this like one of the first things when he was back in? Because I remember that being a thing where like, oh my God, it's Elliot from E.T. This is so cool.
Yeah. And then he proceeded to be in the Haunting of Bly Manor, and then now he's in the new one.
He's in House of Usher,
Every character is completely different, and it's amazing to see him in this new. I was like, holy, like he is just so talented.
He's just so good.
Yeah, which is so great that he's able to now just choose all these roles that are fantastic roles and not be sort of typecast. And he looks different enough from being a kid that people aren't going to be like, oh, it's just Elliot.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of the trajectory of his short round in Indiana Jones.
Key.
Key.
I remember his last name, but yeah. Oh, Key's. Yeah. And now he's in Loki.
Ki Hui.
Yes.
Yeah, and thanks to Everything Everywhere All at Once, he's just like now one of the most established actors after having such a huge break, and it's worked quite well.
But he moved
for him.
He moved behind the scenes. Actually, he was
Kei Huan, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And he was doing
like
stunts
choreography.
Yeah, fight choreography. That's what it was.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's really interesting, and it also shows his range as well. The fact that all these actors play such different roles in the same sort of series show that they're, you know, he's a fantastic actor. And also, it sounds like he had some family trauma as well. They weren't particularly positive about his foray into acting and tried to stop him. Olivia Jackson Cohen, who plays Luke Crane, has a lot to say about mental illness. Because he was in quite a few films that I've seen, including The Invisible Man.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a great film. And he's had a lot of articles where he's talked about how toxic masculinity is so awful, and he really wants to play the roles of someone who perpetuates that to show how damaging it can be, whereas a lot of people tend to avoid those roles because they don't want to be seen in that light. But he's very, very much anti-domestic abuse, etc., and described himself as quite sensitive as well, which is very similar to his character. But he also mentioned that he was diagnosed with PTSD a few years ago, and he's had some childhood trauma in his past, which he brought into the role of Luke. So he said that it felt really cathartic to be able to put it all out there and be there and use all his stuff in his past to play that role. So that's pretty fantastic. I thought he was excellent in it.
Yeah, I did too.
It felt very authentic. Theo, who's my favorite character, I think. The adult version is played by Kate Siegel, who is married to Mike Flanagan and has a 4-year-old. Well, that's the last article I read, which was maybe last year. And I think if you're married to the auteur that is Mike Flanagan, how could you not have some, you know, influence and also some feelings and authenticity in the roles?
Yeah, they only got married in 2016. So they have a more recent relationship, but that's kind of when they started working together.
Yeah, when did this come out? 2019?
2018, I think.
Okay. Yeah, so in 2016, she was in a feature film that he did.
It must be interesting being married to such a creative person.
Yeah, and to be able to like put some of yourself or some of the things that, you know, you want to talk about in there too, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And just a side note, the young version of Theo, McKenna Grace, has scoliosis. Because I also have scoliosis. Scoliosis is very common, but that she's someone who came up as someone who has, you know, gone through the treatment for scoliosis, and it's hard stuff. So I just thought that was interesting.
She also in the new Ghostbusters.
Yep.
That's her,
Oh,
right?
is she?
Yep.
Ghostbusters Afterlife. That's the name. As I'm wearing my Ghostbusters shirt.
Cool.
She is so good and so different. Her character, so different.
Yeah. She even looks completely different from what she does in other films. She's such a very versatile young actress. That's amazing. Lastly, Victoria Pedretti plays Eleanor, or Nell, and she is very open about the fact she was diagnosed with ADHD, although at the time it was ADD when she was 6 years old. She did mention as well she's had an abusive childhood, but didn't go into details, and that's completely reasonable. But also felt she's sort of discussed in an interview how she felt about the ADD diagnosis and didn't feel like the label suited her and didn't enjoy having that label. So yeah, and of course, she was diagnosed quite early on in her life, so there was a lot less understanding and acceptance of that diagnosis at the time, I'm sure.
I think things are continuing to shift. So like anything, like it's just like an ever evolving, other people learning how to understand, and then allowing yourself to be able to be like, yes, this is me, and that's okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was just going to add, so I didn't rewatch the whole series because it was too scary for me to watch it all at once again. But when I started watching it, I was like, oh my gosh, Nell is from the series You, and her character in You is very bad. Like good bad, but like she's like, I was like, oh. So like there's like rewatching it with the character Love from You. And then Nell, because she seems so like gentle and she's helping everybody lift you up and all this stuff, lovely person. And then she's like a murderer. So I'm like, whoa. But like in that world of this haunted house, and she's being a ghost, and then she also has this other character. Anyway, it was really kind of fun to watch it, knowing the other character.
And another example of someone who's just so versatile. He can play someone who's so manipulative and awful, and someone who's just so going through it and just trying to be the best person she could be and just struggle.
Yeah.
It's interesting, as I've noticed a lot of actors come out and say that they've got ADHD, and I feel like, I don't know what you guys might think of this, but I wonder if the film industry attracts a lot of neurodivergent people because of the nature of it and the busyness and the stimulation and
Well, 100%. It's also like the changeability. You get to move from thing to thing. There's you have a different, I mean, it's not necessarily the best for you, but when you are working, you have a very strict, defined schedule, which is perfect for the ADHD brain. Like when I'm in a writer's room is actually the time that I'm working the best, because I have specific hours. And when I'm on script, I know specifically when things are due. And I have to like advocate for myself when I'm not in that. Cause a lot of times working with producers on projects, you're like, okay, when's the deadline? Like, when does it feel right? And I'm like, oh, honey, don't say that to me. I've actually said, I'm like, I will work on this day and night and not sleep. So you need to tell me what's reasonable. They're like, 3 weeks. I'm like, great. 3 weeks it is. Like, that's fine.
But I feel like, Heather, you take that structure that you have from a writer's room and you put it into your day-to-day when you're not in a writer's room, which is what I see you do, which I think is really good. That maybe not all writers would do that.
Well, it's a little deceiving because in a way I do. Like I work every day, but I don't necessarily give myself the breaks that I need.
Yes.
I allow myself sometimes to hyper focus and work for a 10-hour day. Like I had a delivery on the 13th and I worked until midnight and I started that day at 9 a.m. And
so there's nobody telling you to stop because you're not done for the day in the writer's room. Yeah. Okay.
Right. So I'm trying to give myself more like, okay, I will finish at this time and I'll go make dinner and I'll do this and go for a walk. But because I do move from thing to thing or even place to place, I live in different countries, I need transition periods. I don't give myself sometimes a day off between big projects. Like I'm trying to learn how to do that more. Whereas I know other people, which is difficult. Like I talked to someone the other day, they're like, how are you so prolific? And I said, ADHD. I was kind of being cheeky. And they're like, but how? Like my child has ADHD and I can't get them to do their homework. I'm like, because it's not interesting.
Boring.
I love writing and I love being in these worlds. And sometimes it's very hard and I have to trick myself. Like I have to go to coffee shops. I have to print off something and take it somewhere. I have to change the environment, change the medium. Like I have to do different things. But it's like, it's something I love and it's a puzzle and I'll go back and like, how do I fix this puzzle? How do I make this one page less? Like those are games.
It's a challenge.
And I find it's a challenge and my brain loves that. Whereas I know people who I've talked to who have ADHD, probably ADHD-I, they're like, oh.
Inattentive.
Sorry. Inattentive. That's the word. They're like, I can do it once and then I can't do more. Like I can't. I have trouble and I'm like, oh, but I hyper focus like, but it damages my body and my bladder and my life and like my relationship. So
it's interesting you say like the switching medium and switching places is, I do that too with editing. I don't have ADHD. I wonder if that's part of just a creative thing too. Like some of that stuff, like a creative process.
Why
thing
not?
That maybe a lot of creatives have.
Yeah, it depends on your process. Everyone has a different process. Stephen King, I don't know what Stephen King has, probably something, but
Something.
there's something there. I mean, look at what he's writing. But he gets to his desk and he has a very defined, like, I write from this time to this time.
Yeah.
And that's my time.
Mhm.
It's hard. Like, I will put off. I wrote this thing where I knew that Act 3 of 6, the midpoint, was going to be really emotionally difficult. And I was going to cry while I wrote it because it was people telling their truth in a very damaging way. And I'm like, I'm leaving that to last because it is actually emotionally draining and difficult. And someone I was talking to, the writer, was like, that's some of the most fun. I'm like, I'm not saying it's not fun. I'm just saying it's going to hurt my heart and I need to give it like its own space. And I won't be able to write anything else unless I give it space.
And you saying that, I just talked with an editor who cut a really intense series, and there was one scene in it. She cut Dahmer, and it's the victim statement scene. She had to wait to the end because it was so important and so heavy. Anyway, so like I just think creativity in general is just so cool. But that's not what
It's fascinating.
That's not what we're here to talk about, but I think it's fascinating, yes.
I think that's a really important point because I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding around ADHD and that if you can't concentrate on anything, then you have ADHD, or if you know, you struggle in class. And like, I've been in that position where they're exploring an ADHD diagnosis, but they're saying, oh, but they really like art, but they can't concentrate in maths. So if they can do it in art, then clearly they have the capability and they don't have ADHD. It's just behavior or whatever. And it's like, no, that's not the truth. It's, if it's interesting and stimulating, then
that's exactly
there's the capability there. It doesn't mean they don't have ADHD.
I said to this guy who's the dad, I said, we have a different drivers than other people. Like, I remember being at a job where they tried to like motivate me with money. I'm not motivated by money in any way. So I'm like, that's awesome. I want more money. Like, why wouldn't I? But
it's not going to make you more productive.
No, I'm going to do the same. But I'm like, it's like interest and it's novelty, which is, I think, the creative space of jumping from project to project.
Yes.
And, you know, I think sometimes, especially as a writer, they try to pin you into like, you're only this writer. And my agent's great because he's like, write whatever you want. And thematically, they're all very similar, but I can write across genres because, and I'm like, because otherwise my brain would like implode. Like, I wouldn't be able to function if I couldn't just do lots of different things because it's where my brain wants to go. And so I allow it to do that. Cause I'm like, no one can don't put baby in the corner. Right. Like, I'm like, I have oppositional defiance. Like, please, I'm like, I'm going to, you tell me not to do it, I will 100% do it.
Yeah.
I don't know why I've never thought of this before with, like, obviously Heather and I are sisters. We talk all the time. We have a podcast together, but her way of working is exactly the way I work and my world. And I'm always jumping between shows and genres and things. And I've never really connected that. Anyway, I just think it's really interesting that we both do that.
I'm going to throw out another like thing of, we also come from the world of, so we grew up very poor and we grew up with, you know, a very difficult situation. And I joke, but not joke, that I write like poverty's chasing me. Yes. And I think that there is, the reason why we're doing so many things is not just because this is a creative process. It's like, how do I do as many things as I can so I don't drown?
Yeah.
And then I'll be drowning in all the things that I have to do.
Well, of course, it's like not useful, but
it's not useful.
We carry our trauma with us from that. And we're like, I have a hard time. Like, my husband's like, you have enough things going. I'm like, no, I'm going to go do this pitch thing. Why? You literally have no more time. And I was like, but I have to be prepared for what's next. And so lots of people are like, you're amazing. You have all these things you're doing. And I'm like, it's a compulsion and a love, but it's also a huge, huge fear that drags me down and seeps out of my core when I'm in the, like, a place of, which is, I think, very relative to the show that we're talking about, but like, it seeps into me in a way that, like, sometimes it just seeps out of me. That idea of like, I overshare, but I will overshare about everything. Like, I guess I'm eating ramen for the next, like, whatever months. I can't, you know, do this job, or I can't do part, you know, it's like, no matter how much work you do, it's a long game. Yeah. But it's a fear-driven economy. So I'm like, how do you not be full of fear when you come from a place where you literally at times didn't eat?
Always been full of fear. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways.
And I guess also there's modeling as well, perhaps between sisters as well. I've completely forgotten already. Heather, are you the older sister?
I'm the oldest, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So you've perhaps modeled to your younger sister, you know, this is the process you have, and you can't help but pick it up, Sarah, because
possibly.
You know.
I had ambition for days. Like, I was going to be the youngest author. There was a girl in my grade 6 class who's really good illustrator. And I was like, well, we're going to make a book together. And she's like, I just like drawing. I don't want to write a book. And I was like, but we must, because we must be the youngest authors. And she didn't go for it. And it really ruined my future.
Thanks, girl from grade.
I think you're doing very well, though, regardless of that young girl. So, on that note, let's pivot to. No, this is so interesting. But I guess the big question that Haunting of Hill House poses is what's going on mental illness or is it ghosts? Which doesn't have an answer. I feel like the answer at the end is it's probably both or it's not. It's neither. Mm-hmm. But the usual question we ask at this point in the podcast is, what is the accuracy of what we see on screen? And this is a fantastical piece, but there are definitely some mental illnesses or processes that we see in the film, which is also, I think we agree, is explored through the metaphors of ghosts or spirituality. What were your thoughts on, I guess, that big question in general?
Yeah, I think there's definitely lots of the ghosts are the things that haunt us, but also haunt us on screen. Like, I think it did a good job of, I know for myself, because I have generalized anxiety disorder, there's so many moments when that anxiety felt like it just felt so authentic to how I feel. And so I think they portrayed those moments amazingly. Like it just took me to places that I maybe didn't want to go sometimes, so then I had to hide under the blanket. But those are, and that's carried from trauma too sometimes, some of the trauma stuff. I think they did a good job.
Yeah. I mean, Flanagan says a love story and a ghost story is similar, but I'd say like every experience and a ghost story is similar. The idea, he said, when we fall in love with someone, we're birthing a new ghost, something that will follow us for the rest of our lives. But if you actually expand that and say, every experience we have is a ghost we carry for the rest of our lives, because it is. Yeah.
And I think with anxiety, like there's so many moments that I'm like, something will like, I'll hold on to in my anxiety brain. And it is like carrying a ghost with me. I'm feeling emotional about that idea, but that's totally what it is. It's like you have these moments in life that maybe somebody who didn't deal with anxiety would just like, it would float away. It would go into the other world, right? It would cross over. Yeah. But we hold on to these, I'll hold on to those feelings or those thoughts will take me, and it'll sit with me, just like the man in the hat, right? Just follows him.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. I think it's both, because it's like the ghosts are a metaphor. It's grappling. They are your internal thing. I like what Stephen said. Ghosts are guilt. Ghosts are secrets. Ghosts are regrets, are failings, but most times ghosts are a wish. And I thought it was beautiful.
Yeah, I guess there's different ways of looking at it, because I feel similar to you, Sarah, in that a lot of my generalized anxiety disorder comes out in some of those fears of myself failing, but also things that have happened in the past that put me back there. Like PTSD, or maybe even complex PTSD, where the ghost is, what could have been, or what I thought was going to happen that didn't happen, or whatever it might be, and coming back to haunt you. And particularly with, it's maybe skipping ahead a bit, but with Nell's bent neck lady, the fact that she's constantly haunted through her whole life by this woman who ends up being herself. Like, that's like, whoa.
Yeah.
And that's just like, shit.
And it feels like that still feels so relevant to anxiety when it's kind of
100%
unmanaged, or you don't understand your safety mechanism, your safety behaviors, or the things that you do to keep it going, is that you are the person that you are causing.
You're afraid of. Yeah.
You're doing it to yourself. And it's.
Yeah. And I have pretty severe death anxiety that I've learnt strategies to manage, but when it hits, it's like really hard to shift from. And I feel like that's such a metaphor for it, because it's inevitable. We're all going to die. Yep. And being afraid of that is it feels ridiculous, because like, what can you do about it? And I feel like that was a really good metaphor for that. And like, she could not escape the bent neck lady, because she was the bent neck lady. Oh, it really hits me.
Yeah. I think there was something that I was thinking a lot about. I originally thought, well, it's about the inevitability, right? Of like, when you have mental illness, the inevitability in your family sometimes that you'll have it or whatever. But then I started thinking about, is it more about a representation of suicidal ideation? This idea that it's actually even though it ends up being an accident and her death, like that idea, did she choose or did she not? And it really feels like she didn't choose. But is it something where it's like the idea of dying and the idea of looking at death and thinking about death, but in the way that it's represented in this film is really her death, her actual death, because she's thinking about her actual death. And so even though we then go, it's actually her death and she's haunted by herself. I'm like, but she's haunted about the idea of death.
Yeah. And the fact that according to everybody, she ends her own life, whether it's a choice or not, she's haunted by.
Yeah, whether she meant to, or is she skirting that? Like the idea of like, is this something I really want? Like, but that obsession, that thinking of death. And like, there are people sometimes, from what I understand, that they have the suicidal ideation, but they still let someone know. Like they still let someone know, and there is a chance for them to live. Yeah. And so they are skirting it, but not necessarily. Whereas there's other people who don't tell anyone, and then they're found. Yeah. And so like, we know this from our own experience with family. But like, then you have that question of like, you know, did she mean to die, or is it more that she was trying to find a way to get relief and find closure, but in doing so ends up dying?
Yeah, which just that in itself is a metaphor for being suicidal and having that ideation and trying to, and depression in general, and just wanting
to feel
it to stop.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think also often, like I also have lived with depression in my life, and I have people in my life that have dealt with depression like chronically. And there's always this, not for me, but there's been people I've known that the idea is that I will eventually die by suicide. That is just inevitable. That's just something that's going to happen. And so I don't know if that's what Nell, like the bent neck lady, is showing her, like, well, eventually this is what's going to happen. And maybe be in a depressive state is, well, eventually it's just going to get to that. So how can I just, it's just going to show me that all the time, because that's where I'm going to end up.
Yeah. And she goes away. She goes away and then comes back after her husband dies.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
it's sort of
because she went back into that depressive state again, right? Which is when, there you go, which is when you often have these ideas of suicide, because it's, you want the pain to stop.
Yeah. I think it's also relevant that she tries to tell everybody and is not believed and not validated in what's happening to her.
Yeah.
And I feel like it feels quite resonant in maybe a metaphor for society, and that there's not enough resources and support out there for people in these situations where they can actually get the help they need, and mental illness is not given as much gravity and legitimacy as physical illness is. And I'm being very broad, but
it's true though.
You know, if someone just maybe, this is happening to you. And her husband was probably the closest it came to that. And then he died.
He was literally her technician for her sleep paralysis. No one believed her but her sleep paralysis, and he did. And he was there to help her through it, and no one else was there to help her through it. And then she did try like little things, like Steven says, like you in your crystals, and you're like, he's like making fun of her, really grasping at straws at anything, like what's going to give me relief. And the one thing could be maybe this idea of her family actually stop running from their pain and stop running from and hiding and being cowards. They were being cowards in terms of their own. That's really harsh to say, but they didn't want to face what was going on, right?
In different ways,
in different ways. And in doing so, if they believed her, if they allowed them to say, yes, this is real, then they would have to admit that what they're dealing with was real
100%.
too.
Exactly.
And so it was too difficult.
Which is a lot.
Yeah. So then instead they're like, and she'll be fine because she goes through these states and then everything's fine until everything isn't.
And how often though does that happen in a family?
Exactly.
Like, all the time. And I've been guilty of that in the past with my own family members. Sorry, family. But, and I'm sure the same things happened for me when I was in like intense bouts of anxiety, because I think you can't fix the person. You can't just make it stop. Like you just have to be there. And it's sometimes really hard.
Yeah. And you have to sit with it
in
that discomfort. And that's really difficult.
If you're unchecked, if you have things that you're dealing with, it's hard to be with someone who's maybe not well if you're not well, if you're not ready to face that. So I can see it's human nature in a lot of ways. Sucks, but
I think we see that a lot with Theo, like when she goes and visits her and she gets really frustrated with her in the state of her room and says, I just wanted to hang with my sister and go to the beach and cry. Like, the way that she wanted to deal with it was not what Nell was in the state to do.
Right. Like she is so highly empathetic, like literally because she touches people and
she can't help it.
She can't help it. But because she can be so insightful, she is actually emotionally unavailable. That's her protection. So she's like, I'm just going to like check out.
Yeah.
And so she doesn't want now to want to talk about it because then she has to talk about it. So instead, like,
and that's
how
super
about
painful for her.
Yeah. How about I drink instead?
Or have sex.
And how about I'm going to just destroy myself, but I'm going to make sure that no children get hurt anymore. Like she's helping other people, but never herself.
She's directing that empathy to others who need it because that's easier to do.
Yeah.
And then trying to numb her own experiences and how it affects her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we talk about sleep paralysis? Can we talk about that now?
Yes, let's talk about that.
It's intense, and I have had sleep paralysis a few times, and one time was when I was visiting Heather in London, and it does feel like there is something coming for you. It is terrifying, and it comes about when you're stressed or your sleep schedule is all like wonky or whatever it might be. But a very cool thing to use as something in a series like this, because it is almost supernatural when you have that experience, or paranormal, or whatever you want to say.
Yeah.
And it's like explainable, but not when you're
not when it's happening, because like you're like laying there and you can't move and you hear this loud sound and like you can see but you can't see, and you can see your arm and you're moving it but it's not moving. Like it is intense until you understand what it is. And I think it was with Heather. I'd experienced it probably 3 or 4 times, and then I was with Heather and I said, this thing happened, like what is going on? Because I hadn't really talked about it. And then because you're really great at research, you started looking up the things I was telling you, and you were able to I was able to learn what it was, and we had an explanation. So the next time it happened, because it's happened, especially when I had my daughter, it happened a few times. Again, disruption of sleep and all the things. But I was like, oh, this is happening. Just wait a few seconds. And I was able to like talk myself while I'm in the state out of it until my arm would move. Right. But if I didn't have that research component of Heather telling me like, oh, this is a thing, you're not losing your mind, which is what I thought was happening. Yeah. So like her husband supporting her through that, and then having that be gone, and it's hard. Yeah,
hard to watch. I know just a little bit about the history of sleep paralysis, and that there was those sort of experiences in the past of ghosts or of spirits or demons, which would, when you look back, it was actually sleep paralysis that was happening. Because it makes sense, because you're not fully awake, you're still sleeping, you can still be dreaming, but your body's is in that you're asleep state, so your muscles can't move. Yeah, it's super terrifying. I've only experienced it a few times, but I had a friend who I lived with who had night terrors. Poor thing, it was awful. And yeah, I feel like that was conveyed fairly well in that, like, the strategies that he was talking through seem pretty like legitimate and helpful, and also just the fact that, while she was with him, they weren't really happening, but then, they came up every now and then, which suggests, she's going through a stressful time. And then when he does pass away, they're amped up again. I think, Well,
especially as, I'm sorry, but Nell and Luke got the bad
really
end of the stick, because
I know
they not only were completely terrorized by ghosts, they also were of a family that were all emotionally unavailable.
Yes.
They were abandoned. They literally, Luke was almost murdered by his own mother. And like, it's like very bad. Like and then like Nell loses her husband. She's abandoned. She's unprotected by her family. Her twin brother is like ruined by addiction, and she's essentially helping him because she has no one else to turn to help her. Yeah. She's internalizing all of her pain. Of course she's having sleep paralysis and thoughts of death.
Yeah. Yes.
Like she is like, no one will listen to her.
Her older siblings are sort of like treating her like a burden, as they do with Luke as well. And something they just have to deal with, which is just does not help.
Yeah. And also, if you really think about it, both Stephen and Shirley became their parents.
Totally. Yeah, exactly.
So like they were
support them financially, but
they were being parented. Luke never had to grow up. He didn't learn coping mechanisms. Like it's just, they were left adrift with the only parental figures were 2 emotionally unavailable children. Who were
also going through their own trauma and processing of what had happened.
And then Theo's off doing whatever because she's the middle child and is like, peace. And then like I'm out. And then this weird dichotomy of children taking care of children and an emotionally unavailable father who realizes eventually that he really screwed up.
Yeah. And it's interesting, everyone's memories of of what happened and how they cope with
Yes.
it, and their memories of the mother as
Yeah.
well, and
Yeah.
how that they've come to those places of coping. Like for Stephen, he remembers the nurturing maternal woman that she was before all of these traumas happened. So he's just like, it was mental illness. Dad didn't deal with it. Fuck you
Yeah.
all.
We all have
Yeah.
it.
No one will talk about mental illness in this family, but he doesn't do it in a way of understanding. It's just like, yeah, mental illness is terrible. And I don't want to have kids. I don't want my kids to have mental illness because it's this horrible. And that's why he finds it all so frustrating. And he just identifies like Luke and Nell as like people who aren't able to help
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah.
But yet he makes all this
'cause he-
money off of, I don't know how much money he made, but he's like writes the ghost the stories of his the trauma and makes to work
Yeah,
for
he
him.
manipulates
Yeah.
it to serve
Yeah.
himself.
He's a fixer, right? His dad's a fixer. He's a fixer. And I get this as someone
He
who
was
is
the
also a
fixer as
fixer.
the older child.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. As the oldest
Yes.
fixer here,
Yes.
recovering fixer.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. One more time.
and the anger it would bring inside of
Mhm.
me to not be able to fix things, to be the repetitiveness of like anxiety, that dealing with other people's anxiety and being like, but just then don't do that anymore, or
Yeah.
leave that person, or make a different choice because like you are making me into an insane person. And then when you're like,
I don't.
that's what I felt like. And
know.
I don't,
Yeah.
not saying it lightly. I was just like, oh my God, I'm so angry. And I realized it's because I felt powerless.
Mm.
And the fixing comes with control, and control means
Yes.
that you're safe.
Mm-hmm.
And so in Steve, I see someone who has controlled his life to a point where he's alone
Yep.
and lonely, and who is basically terrified that he, like, if he lets go of control, that he too will, like, I talk about this a lot. Like, I always waited for a long time for the other shoe to drop. When am I going to have agoraphobia? When will I not be able to leave my house? When will I have anxiety? Like, when will I have these things? I know it's inevitable and I'm scared. I don't have those things, but it was that fear that I carried with me. And I feel like the same thing where he's like, he creates this state of control and anger and dismissiveness because he has to, that's the only thing he can tether himself to.
Yeah.
And I
It keeps him contained.
and keeps him contained. And this like idea that, well, if I can lean on something rational,
Yes.
that it means that's the only thing that's real. And it's doing so has completely severed his emotions from his rational brain. And he doesn't think in any emotional way. It's all through the guise of like the rational brain.
Yeah.
And we are humans, so we need both sides. We have to make decisions with both things. And in doing so, you saw in the show how he actually isolated himself from everything and everyone because of his skepticism, because of his inability to be emotionally connected to anyone.
I think you see that through the earliest scene where he's at the woman's house investigating some possible paranormal activity. And the way he deals with it is just so matter of fact and dismissive of her. And she's like, so you're saying that what I saw wasn't what I saw? He feels like it's his job to rationalize away everything. That's his purpose.
That's why I love the episode. It's called Steve Sees a Ghost. And it's the first time he sees a ghost, and it's of his sister, who he basically like let down because he's going to carry that.
Abandons.
And he's abandoned, and he's going to carry that with him.
And I think throughout the whole film is him trying to not succumb to his fear that he experiences mental illness himself. So seeing that's really rattled him. And you can see him like during the Two Storms episode where they're in the funeral home, he's constantly saying, get it together. Like, don't slip into what he sees everybody else going into that he cannot fathom for himself.
At the end of the show, when you have the scene that you will never have, where you can talk to the person who died and apologize and essentially wipe away the sins and the guilt that you will be carrying, the ghost that you will carry of your sibling, by saying like, oh, I'm sorry that I didn't pick up the phone. I'm sorry. And then, but Steven says, I'm sorry I never listened. And I think that's a big thing of like fixers. The thing that I've learned personally is that you have to ask the question, do you want to fix this, or do you want me to listen?
Yeah.
And then once you have that answer, then that's what you need to do. And all he needed to do was listen. And he could not be open enough to listen.
Yeah, definitely. I want to talk more about that scene.
That's
but
a good one.
But just on the topic of Stephen, I guess moving to Shirley as well, I feel like she's also someone who tries to control to cope. but in a very different way from Stephen. Like, she's a lot more nurturing, but her sort of way of controlling is, I don't know, it's more making sure her house is in order.
She's a perfectionist.
Yeah, she's a total perfectionist. Like the funeral home scene, everything being exactly right and having the right flowers and all of that sort of stuff. Not quite as pathological, but still, like, I feel like she's probably the most together of all of them, maybe, but not really.
It feels like that, but
she's
is
just
it?
Yeah, exactly. She presents that face.
right, but she's just not haunted by the dead. She's haunted by the living, like her own guilt of her. Like she has a different haunting, and like she basically is. She wants to be nothing like her parents, so of course is exactly like her parents. Like that idea of like keeping secrets and brewing anger and like keeping everything under wrap. Like, it's cool, I'm perfect, and so that means I'm completely inflexible. So that's not ideal.
Yeah. I forgot about her haunting being the person she has a brief affair with as well. And I wonder if her biggest fear is not being perfect, is having made a big mistake in her marriage and being found out as actually fallible and perhaps not such a good person that she thinks she is.
Yeah, do you know what could have helped them all? Just maybe communication. Just straight up talking. Yeah, that's it. Just talking.
A little bit of talking and a little
Just
bit of listening. That's all we needed.
Same with Hugh. Like I find that storyline quite hard, that after it occurs, he's obviously not convicted of having anything to do with his wife's death as far as we see. And he sort of packs the kids off to live with their aunt, and he's, AWOL.
Disappears, yeah.
Why? Why don't you want to support your kids through what they've just experienced?
Well, because he can. Because he's a man in the 90s who can just, who could just go away, who could take the kids to the aunties and say, I can't do this right now, and walk away.
I'm noping out of this, And if he had been a less typical dad and more even asked for help himself, I guess he could have actually given them some support that would have helped them through their trauma.
Yeah, totally.
But they were instead abandoned
and added more trauma.
Basically, he was like, I'm gonna check out emotionally, and I'm gonna totally focus my attention to the memory of my wife, who we actually physically see, so we know he's being haunted by the memory of his wife, and he'd rather be prioritizing the memory of someone dead than his own children. Which really checks out.
Safer, easier. I don't know. Yeah, like
it's less complex.
Yeah, feels easier.
Less difficult.
Or it's like you're staying in the pain instead of dealing with it. Because again, like everyone is like, we're just gonna deny everything. Like he's denying that his children are hurting. Like he's denying that he needs to be responsible.
Yeah.
So everyone's in denial, and everyone won't talk to anybody, and then they only talk to someone when someone dies.
Yeah.
That's the only time they come together.
Which again is like so indicative to many a family, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Good family show.
Let's go to grief, because there's so much to say. The fact that when they come together at Nell's episode at the funeral home, the dynamics between them and the arguments is just so, it's just so bang on, because when a family member dies, you think this is a time to come together and support each other, but it's often the opposite of what happens. And when my brother passed away, the first month was difficult, not just because we were all grieving, but there was a lot of tension, and everyone was in their own sort of grief experiences and waves, which we continue to be in. And it meant that tensions were high. So a comment could be made and that would just be completely interpreted the wrong way. And then we'd end up fighting. It didn't happen a lot, but there was a few moments where it was like my sister had to be the one. She's the youngest, but she's the most rational. And she's got ADHD, so I don't know if that's related. But she was just like, guys, we're supposed to be supporting each other. Can you stop? Like, nothing matters now. Our brother's dead. So stop fighting. It's really hard to remind yourself of that fact because you're stuck in your head. You're going through your own feelings, and you don't have as much control over your filter, and you're more vulnerable. So I felt like those ups and downs during that episode were very relatable.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think like how people deal with grief and how we have to, in our society, we did an episode on grief with this belief that in 12 months, everyone's fine. And this is 26 years later.
Nobody is fine.
None of them are fine because grief inevitably changes you for the rest of your life. And this idea that if you do not allow yourselves to grieve in the way of like community, and then understanding that your life will be changed and not expecting it to just go back to the way it was, because there is no back to the way it was, and that like your life moving forward, you will carry that with you. Doesn't mean you have to always be sad, but instead they just locked everything up. All of them are like, luck. We're not going to talk about mom. Like no one talked about her, like zero talking about mom. It felt like.
Only person that really brought her up was really Hugh, in the fact that he was talking to her constantly. And then Stephen saying, you know, mom died because she was crazy. And then, we're all good. Yeah. And I think it's also very indicative, like for me, like there's before and after. So like, you know, that event of this person dying is like colors everything. And when you think of how long they actually spent in Hill House, it wasn't a significant chunk of time, but it's a very before and after because of what actually occurred there and has colored the rest of their lives.
And I feel like being in Hill House, all of the things that led up, because if we go on the idea that maybe mom was dealing with mental illness that led to death by suicide, it was evolving and getting worse through that whole time they were in that house. So that whole period of time could feel like a million years when you're dealing with someone who's progressively getting sicker. And then there's that end point, and then you want to erase all of that, but you can't, because it does feel like a lifetime. Those moments of that whatever you call that. The trauma. There you go. That trauma.
That's And I think that idea of like the red room, I've been thinking about this a lot of times, is that it is actually coping mechanisms and how people are trying to ignore through a coping mechanism what is a reality. So yes, they say like the house is digesting, it's the stomach of the house, and it puts on faces that would be still and quiet while it digested. But if you look at it, it's like Theo's dance studio, and dance is what she loved to do. It was a reading room for mom. It was a game room for Stephen, a family room for Shirley because she desperately just wanted family. Toy room was for Nell, and then a treehouse for Luke. They were their places of sanctuary. But it wasn't real sanctuary. It was them coping with someone important in their life, basically like going through something major. Like I know as I would cope by reading. That was my escape. Like I escaped the world and I just read all the time. And I identify with those things as coping mechanisms for like, the world is too hard right now. I'm going to just go and hide. And this is what they're doing.
Do you think they were interpreting that as not a good thing to have that escape or have that coping strategy?
I think did it go too far though? I think it was probably good at first. It helped at the beginning because they were using that to not deal, right? But when you're young, that's what they did to feel better. But eventually you have to actually work on the trauma that's making you need to go hide or go to that safe space.
You actually have to
know why, like what, how can I be safe not in this space but in all the spaces?
Right. We talk a lot about that, right? Just in general, coping mechanisms, how the things we've learned to get through childhood, we have to undo as adults.
That's all I'm doing right now in therapy is like, what are my safety behaviors because of anxiety? And that some of that's learned maybe in a way. Some of it is just the nature of anxiety, but understanding the things I'm learning, like everybody does this, whatever I do. Well, no, that's actually a safety behavior to get me through the anxiety I'm feeling, as opposed to being like, oh, I'm feeling this anxiety. It'll eventually pass. I don't have to now research for 8 hours on the toe that hurts or whatever that might be, right? Like that's a basic example. But so like I think at first it feels like it's helping, but it doesn't help forever.
No.
Yeah, it starts to eat you from the inside because you're not dealing with. So literally like the idea of it being a stomach, that your coping mechanisms that are hiding your pain is the thing that ends up eating you. But it makes sense.
Totally makes sense.
And I looked up lots of things like, what do other people think about the red? But no one talked about that. And I was like, oh, but this is just, it's keeping you complacent in the face of horror, right? It's like your coping mechanism when you can't deal with how bad the world is being. And then Hugh, they say, never found the red room because the whole house was his red room. Because he was just trying to fix it. Always like the mold. I got to fix it. I got to fix it. Imagine if he if he let go and admitted that he can't fix everything. What if he had felt secure enough with his family to be able to talk about how he is feeling and how this is maybe beyond them, and that maybe it's better for them to move on, and that better them to like get help, or better to like deal with what was happening, like seeing his wife unravel, and instead focusing on this rot
Yeah.
without seeing that the rot is happening in his family.
Yeah. And where does the rot come from? Like,
Yeah.
what is the actual issue at hand that needs to be unveiled?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And the fact that they thought that the red room was the heart of the house until Nell actually says, no, it's the stomach. So I guess that's really indicative of when we think the coping strategy is actually helpful and wholesome and there's no malice or there's nothing bad that can come from it, but then realizing that it's actually avoiding what we need to actually deal with.
And I think that's those realizations, I don't know, because it's for me just recently where I'm like, oh, yeah, it would feel a lot better not to continue thinking about the thing that, like, oh, that makes sense. But when you're in it, it consumes you, which again, stomach, it's consuming you.
Yeah.
I feel for Olivia. I feel for her because I think she was literally emotionally exhausted. She had cabin fever.
She had migraines,
anxiety. She's dealing with these children in a house that's falling apart. She is essentially the sole caregiver of these children, and she's overprotective.
And she's trying to design this home as well.
She's trying to do work
for them to live in.
Yeah. So she's like leading all of this and doing all these things and dealing with like a lot of mental health and physical illnesses. And they're like, oh, she's schizophrenic. I'm like, how about she was like doing all the things?
She's being
how about like
a woman in this day and age?
Yes, just being a woman, period.
Yeah, I know.
In the patriarchy.
And her overprotectiveness being pushed over the edge by this ghost. And, Olivia. But I don't know. It's interesting. Like sometimes this happens where you take on so much and then you have a breakdown. Yeah. And why does that mean she's schizophrenic? Could it just mean she had a breakdown because she was trying to protect everyone and couldn't? Yeah. Because it happens a lot.
And it feels like the ghost Poppy saw that in her and manipulated that into, which, could be a metaphor for psychosis and how that can take over when you're at your, particularly people who do have schizophrenia, when there's a buildup of stress and anxiety can lead to a psychotic episode. And the behavior that comes from that is not intentional, whether you can interpret it that way and that, it led to her to becoming homicidal. Yeah. But I think I completely agree, particularly the fact that we see her being so nurturing to the kids in so many episodes, and also the fact that she really relates to her kids in such a way. Like when Theo talks about how she can feel things and she says, yeah, my grandmother was sensitive like that and so am I, and gives her a strategy to help deal with it. Like she's such a good mom in so many of those moments. Yeah. And I think given everything that's happened, I don't think you can explain it all away by, oh, she was just mentally ill.
No. Yeah, those circumstances that she was in were dire.
Yeah.
Were dire. Because also they're like, if we don't do this,
like the pressure on
we
that.
lose everything. And that happens when you have that exceeding pressure. And you see that with people who sadly, because she did die by suicide in this show, you see that with people who get burnout and they'll, like, especially like in finance jobs and things like that, and they will just walk up to their apartment and walk off the balcony. Yeah. Because they're like, I can't, this is too much now. I
can't do it anymore. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not because that they had anything beforehand that would indicate that they had some difficulty with mental health. It was that they burnt themselves out. And so is this actually a case of burnout? And that I know she then becomes homicidal, but it's like in a way that idea of like, oh, without me, you'll not be cared for. Yeah. And it's better for us to die together, which you see
that happen all the time.
You see that happen with women and like their children. And it's like, well, if without me, you'll be lost. And so we'll die together versus me leaving you alone.
And in the show, she thinks that she has to kill her kids in order to save them from the atrocities that are occurring. So
all in all, she was a really good mom. She just loved her kids.
I'm interested though, because it's like, at the end, it's like Hugh and her being together. Like it feels like, I'm just trying to sort of interpret how, Nell comes home and she wants Nell to come home, like the ghost of Olivia. And then Hugh sacrifices himself so that all the other kids can go, and he gives himself to the house. And obviously this is the house, not necessarily Olivia herself, who are consuming all these people. But it also feels like at the end of the day, Nell's there, but it's sort of the relationship between Hugh and Olivia that sort of
saves,
that's sustained. Yeah.
I'm not sure about that either.
But maybe it's that he finally saw, oh, like I screwed up so badly that maybe for the first time I'm going to step up and help my children.
Yeah. That's true.
But it's almost like he's doing that, but he's benefiting because he gets to be with his wife again. Like, is he really losing anything? Not that he has to lose, like, you know, I don't know. Like, is he doing the right thing? I guess his some of his kids are able to move on, and like they show us that they all seem to be doing well and functioning after everything's done.
Supposedly.
But like, was it hard for him to choose that? I don't know if that would be hard for him to choose. Great, I get to hang out with my wife.
On the topic of Theo, can we talk a little bit about her portrayal as a psychologist?
I feel like you need to say stuff because you are trained.
Can I talk about
please tell us what you think.
Yeah, you have to talk about this. Please tell us about
what is right and what is wrong.
I think she was great, and I love also that she's like queer, and that's just like who she is. And it's funny that a couple of her siblings didn't notice, but like everyone else did, and that she's got like a life outside of being a psychologist too. Yes. And it feels balanced because she's still a very good psychologist from what it seems like. And also she's a great psychologist, but also has her own issues, which is very accurate.
Yes.
And I love that her experiences of trauma actually led, I feel, to her, well, it did, choosing that as a field, which is also extremely accurate.
Yeah.
I think if you interviewed any psychologist, they'd be like, yeah, because I had some shit happen when I was a kid and that made me look into this. Yeah, I thought the therapy, it was pretty good, like in terms of what most depictions of therapy are. I think it was pretty good, particularly with kids, because I have worked with kids with trauma backgrounds as well, and the use of like play and, you know, how sessions usually go seem pretty accurate, and then having that sort of chat with the parents afterwards and not sort of divulging what exactly happened in the sessions, but just asking some questions. And my only concern was that she didn't clean the toys afterwards, which I had to do every session.
I like that you made note of that, and that's totally something that if you're doing it, you would like that would clock. Right? Like, like, oh, that's like, the job I don't.
But there's germs everywhere,
especially in our world right now.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess, you know, the one inaccuracy is that you wouldn't just do a drop in to a family's house. But of course, you know, usually psychologists don't have special powers where they can actually feel what's happened to a person.
Can you imagine if your therapist could do that though?
It would make things so much easier.
Easier and harder because they would be there. Like very traumatized.
Yes, I guess. But then
it would be so hard.
That would be hard for the therapist. I didn't think about that. I just thought about my selfishly how beneficial it would be for me.
But it's a good metaphor for how vicarious trauma can occur as a mental health professional, and that you do have to protect yourself because you do end up hearing lots of really traumatic things and have to hold space for someone else's trauma, and you do have to protect yourself from that. Without ending up being not empathetic.
You have to
put
you have to put your gloves on.
You have to put your gloves on, yeah.
No, but the same as kind of pointing at Sarah, which no one can see on a podcast, but editing, documentary filmmaking can, you know, I've done that too, where it's like talking to people. I was interviewing people who had survived Hurricane Sandy in really traumatic situations, talked to people who were in the field, and you're listening to these stories again and again, and it normalizes for you, but it's not something that is actually traumatic.
I've done a lot of work with residential school survivors, and watching that footage, there's moments, even Heather's pointed out, where I'm like, I'm feeling a certain way, and then it'll be like, well, what have you been working on lately? I was like, oh, of course I'm feeling a certain way because I've been dealing with telling somebody's story that is traumatic and trying not to share the parts that could traumatize the audience, but it does in turn affect me.
Yeah. Even if you try, it's hard to avoid that, and you're not necessarily aware of how it's affecting you.
Yeah.
And it was sadly quite accurate in a very brief way, but like the fact that when she discovers the client's abuse and she reports them to child services, although they acted very quickly, I don't think that's accurate. But, she says she's just back in the system. So is this a win? And that's so true. Like the sad part is this little girl who's now not having her foster father abuse her. She's likely to experience abuse in some other ways and not have her trauma dealt with appropriately because she needs to be protected. And unfortunately that system's really flawed.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what is the place that's beneficial? Like, I worked in a program where there's a kid who was being abused, and they took him out of the abusive home, and he went to live with his grandparents who were alcoholics. But it was a better situation for him than it was at the home where the stepfather was beating him. And so they're like, it's not ideal, but it's better. And so that's still so difficult.
It's sadly the reality.
Yes. very much so.
And I love the quote that she says that it's very much about how we deal with traumas, particularly as young kids. She buried it so deep that she made up a monster to compartmentalize it. She needed help and no one was listening. I guess the context between that is she's like the smiley man came.
Yeah.
And what she was actually focusing on once Theo was able to get in the position that she would have been in is that, you know, it looked like a smiley face in the roof while she was being abused. So that's how she's created this monster to cope with the abuse. Just that line was just so perfect of how, especially with horror as well, as we make up monsters to deal with difficult situations.
Yeah.
Because horror heals.
We also was saying that like having sensitive skills and being ultra empathetic, and I sort of thought, is that sort of a code for neurodivergence?
Yeah.
But also complex PTSD as well.
Yes, both.
I lean to complex PTSD.
Yeah.
Personally, but
I think that's, you have to be very aware of everyone's
Hypervigilance.
feelings around you to make sure you're safe.
hypervigilance.
Yeah, totally.
And sometimes that can look similar in neurodivergence as well. And often there's a crossover.
Both and
Yes, exactly.
And
or.
And or.
And/or.
Yeah, definitely. So just to finish up all the neuroses of the family, let's talk a little bit about the substance use from Luke, because that's a huge plot line as well, and his stint in rehab. What did you guys think about how that was portrayed?
I mean,
I feel like
he was, oh my, like, he's from a family of, like, what's great is they did talk about the hereditariness, because Theo also abuses alcohol.
Yes.
Not drugs.
A bit more
but
functionally, it seems.
a bit more yeah. I guess that's functional, but but man, this poor kid, his family's skeptical of everything he says. They don't believe anything, right? I said this earlier. He was tormented by ghosts. He was followed by one, and then he was almost murdered
by his mother.
by his mother, lost everybody, and he was completely isolated in a place where something like substance abuse could be a good place to go to try to help him deal with this idea that has nothing and is alone and completely unbelieved.
Yeah.
I'm like, that tracks. Like, how do I escape
It makes
this?
sense that he got to that.
Yeah.
And even things like they didn't believe that Abigail was real. They thought it was in his imagination. She was a real person. Like just basic things. They just completely
Everything he said
invalidated everything.
Yeah.
It sounded like there was a theme of wanting to be brave and constantly telling him he wasn't a brave person.
And he was being
When
so
he was
brave.
probably the bravest. Because he actually was trying to like deal with it all the time.
Yeah, with no support or help.
Yeah, it's kind of like in those families where we know this from people we know, that you have a person who's like, hey, there was abuse in our family. And then everyone's like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. You're a black sheep now. We don't want to talk to you. Don't come to any parties. Don't be part of this. Like, hey, we're allowed to be here as a group,
happy and
a family, and
love
chat
each
as a
other.
family. But as long as we don't talk about anything bad. And he's like, hey, bad shit happened. Everyone's like, shut up.
Yeah.
Go. We don't want anything to do with you because you're actually telling the truth. Go away.
Well,
And he's like, I guess I will be alone here and I will try to
do some drugs.
find
Feel better.
That's,
And he's still being haunted so much by what has happened, like with the bowler hat guy, tall man. Like
floating man is
He's so
scary.
scary.
Oh yeah, absolutely terrifying. Them saying it doesn't exist, like it doesn't make everything go away.
No.
It makes it.
Makes it more extreme. Makes it worse.
Yeah.
He's literally a few steps away from him.
His entire life. Yeah.
Can you even just like pause and think about? I was just like, I have to walk down a dark hallway when I leave this room, and I'm not looking forward to that because I like you just the feeling of somebody a few steps behind you for your whole life.
Well, what a great metaphor for
Yes.
complex PTSD.
100%.
That you always feel
Being
like you're
watched.
hunted and watched and you're hypervigilant. Yeah.
Well, you have to keep looking around. What's next?
Yeah, you'd keep yourself safe. And like, and him, the way he kept himself safe was to do drugs.
Yeah. And the fact that he struggled so much to get sober because it makes the trauma more real and it's harder to escape something when things are clearer, things are sharper because you're not dulling that pain anymore.
Yeah. Also, you don't, the thing that we did something talking about addiction, and one of the big things is having support mechanism in place.
No support.
He had no support mechanism.
No, he had no one to go to.
Yeah, and when he went to Nell, she helped facilitate his drug use.
Because also she was not in a place to be able to.
No.
She was in her most vulnerable state as well.
Exactly. So they became codependent on each other because that's all
they knew too, right? Exactly. As twins, I think. And them being the littles. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I didn't love how in the rehab facility, and I don't know how accurate this is in rehab, maybe it is, which I have a problem with, when he leaves to go and seek out his friend who had escaped rehab, his support worker or whoever it was said, if you leave, you give up your bed. You did it to yourselves, which I thought was just a really horrible message.
I think that can be accurate for these facilities that are voluntary. And
Yeah.
there is only so many, and there are only so many beds. Like, I think that's probably shitty. I don't think it should be like that. And we need facilities for people who don't have the means to pay for a private rehab space. Like, I was listening to your episode about On a Star Is Born and how beautiful the rehab facility is. Like, if you have the money, you have the means, you'll have a bed.
Yeah.
But you have to pay for it anyway. That's the system is just
Well, if you have the money and the means and you go to jail, your experience is pretty awesome. Comparatively to, you know what I mean? Like everything is better when you have money.
Yeah.
Which is not.
That wasn't the case.
Not for me.
No. Yeah. We have to wrap up soon. Let's talk about some of the helpful messages and the harmful messages. And I guess we'll touch on some of the stereotypes as we talk about it. I guess, firstly, how did you find this show helpful for you personally?
I have a quick feeling. I thought for a series that was like a horror show that was scary and spooky, like very scary, to have it feel like everybody was lived happily ever after, like actually made me feel good. Like I felt like, nice. Oh, what a happy ending. So like in a small little bite-sized thing, I was happy with how it made me feel good in the
how it ended.
Yeah. Like that, the stuff that Nell like really closes out with like, but the idea that there's no without, I'm not gone, I'm scattered into so many pieces sprinkled on your life, like new snow. I love that, like we talked about confetti, but it was brought into this too. It's like that idea that, that you are always, you were loved, I was loved and you were loved and the rest is confetti. Like, as in like the rest is fine. It doesn't matter. Like love is all that matters. And I think what's hopeful, why it's hopeful is finally all of them have finally talked and they finally have to let go of those coping mechanisms that aren't working anymore. Like the isolation and a lot of it's isolation and that those roadblocks they put in place. And so finally they're like, oh, we can move forward without that. But it took this loss to allow them to do it.
I love that. I remember watching it the first time and thinking it was a bit silly, but then that was before things happened in my life that made it more relatable. But just that speech to her siblings and how they're all apologize, and then she's like, it wouldn't have mattered. It was just kind of what I needed at that moment too, because a lot of what my family's been experiencing is what ifs. What if this had happened or that had happened? Also, just that understanding that she's not gone. It's just a different sort of state of being, and she'll always be there in their lives. And I think that's really something that I'm holding on to at the moment, in that just because someone's died doesn't mean they are not in your life anymore. That was just incredible. I guess also that theme of like family is a home you can never leave, like in a more foreboding way, like the house they could never leave, but it's also like you'll always belong here almost.
Yeah.
And that idea of the fixer and not, you can't fix everything. It just is. This is just is. And to be able to understand that, and by being able to accept that this just is, allows you to let so much more in.
Yes.
I think that's a huge message in the entire show. Like, it's not about ignoring whether it's mental illness or hauntings. It's not about blaming it. It's not about like accusing people of being this way or that way, or seeing it as something that's unnatural. It's just accepting it for what it is and making space for it.
And I love that idea, like thinking back again to that, if we take the idea of every love story as a ghost story and make it to every moment of our lives, it becomes a ghost, and the people that are in it populate your world with many ghosts of them that you carry with you.
That's so good, because it's like someone might have touched your life in one way and then someone else in a completely different way. So those ghosts can be very different to each person as well, even though they're the same person.
Yeah, and they're not always bad. Sometimes they're a wish.
Mike Flanagan.
I love that. And before we wrap up, any harmful messages?
Well, always the woman that has to be the person,
the crazy one.
Like, come on. That's frustrating.
Yeah, I will say, like, that ending, the happy ending that no one have after suicide, where everyone gets to talk out their feelings and be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, and then get resolution from the person who died. I'm like, well, that's nice, but that's not real.
It's not real.
Yeah.
But as we spoke, like,
Is it hard for her? Yeah.
to communicate, watching something like this, maybe it'll make you want to communicate.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Maybe.
There's-
I mean, it's not harmful, but it's
And to have those conversations before, is it harmful? Is it just unrealistic? Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah. I guess it could potentially glamorize and
Yeah.
make enticing the idea of suicide to anyone who feels that way, particularly young minds. But
Maybe, yeah. But they're not going to. Are you thinking of coming back as a ghost to say the things that you didn't get to say? I don't know.
yeah.
I don't know.
No, no. But also, I think it could be quite comforting for anyone who has lost someone to be able to have that conversation in their heads, or
Yeah.
you know, write a letter, or you know, be able to share those feelings
Yeah.
to the ghost.
Yeah. So maybe you can have those resolutions, but you do it, and it does. Yeah. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that we had in here, which I put too, that like that Nell was a Bentley lady, and that I'd thought about it for a long time as being the inevitability of mental illness and the cyclical nature of it, that it comes, that you carry it with you. But then when I shifted my thinking, so then I'm like, well, that's harmful. That this idea that you can never escape it.
You can't escape it. Yeah.
But then once I shifted my thinking, when I started thinking about it and was like, oh, if it is more about her feelings of death and her own death and suicidal ideation, that changes what it is.
Mhm.
So it isn't harmful. It is the reality of what she's dealing with her depression.
Yeah.
It turns it into something that I'm like, it's not inevitable. It's more that that's her looking back almost at the moments where she felt closest to death versus it being like,
Yeah.
you were going to end up this way.
And I feel like her monologue at the end is kind of like, now I understand
Yes.
the comfort in knowing that time isn't linear and like everything is confetti and the love is sort of what remains. I feel like that's her sort of coming to terms with the fact that being afraid of death your whole life isn't necessarily the way to be, I guess.
Yeah.
The other harmful thing is Stephen deciding that he's gonna just not have kids because he doesn't want them to have a mental illness. Like,
Yeah, that's very
I'm
ableist.
fine. I have a mental illness and I am fine and I'm living a great life. But I know that's
Well,
the thing. That's the thing people do a lot. They talk about
It's
it a
that
lot.
sense that mental illness is a death sentence.
Exactly. Same
But
with
I know that I've thought about it myself. I mean, there's many reasons. I don't have children. I think part of it was definitely like I raised my family. So I'm like, I did it, guys. I raised people in my, like, that's what it felt like. I was taking,
You already have your babies.
yes, they're all grown and I'm so proud of them.
good God.
But I think there is something I understood where he was coming from. And I feel like there are people, and it's not because I think anything is wrong with me or anyone who's mental illness, but there is something of like, is this the path that I want someone else to have to take?
Yeah.
And if I want to give my love, why does it have to be someone that I have biologically? Why can't I take care of someone who needs love, who may not be someone that is born from me?
I don't think that's what he's looking at though. Like
No, he doesn't want to have children. Like she wants to have children from him with his sperm, and he's like,
yes.
nope.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So he doesn't want to procreate because he's scared of everything that his
ghost.
family's facing,
Yeah.
because that's the ghost of his mom. And it's hard because it's complex, and it's like, I love all the people in my life. Do I want someone who struggles to leave the house?
Now,
And I don't, it's like, it's complex.
it's totally
Because
complex.
I would love the person regardless, but then
Remind
it's
me
like, yeah.
she's pregnant, right? Or that's the dream. I'm trying to remember the end.
So I believe in the end she's pregnant. So we're to believe that maybe he got a reverse vasectomy.
Which you can do.
So he changes his
So he
mind.
healed, and maybe realized that if we have the right tools in life, that it can be okay. No
Yeah,
matter
and it
what
will be
else
okay, but
does.
also like, yeah, I can understand
But
why someone would
That would be
feel-
something you would question.
that you
yeah.
question or think about, and you're like, you know, it happens a lot.
I think that happens a lot in
A lot of
disability. Like, you know, all the things people
But-
talk about it
yeah.
a lot, and it's hard.
But it happens
Yeah, it's just-
with people who, and especially, or things of poverty, or things like where it becomes like, can we bring children into this world? And climate change, like, it's not just mental illness.
the way the world
Yes,
is.
it's like, do I want to
all
bring
the
my
things, yeah.
child into this environment? And this
Everything.
environment could be like lots
Yeah.
of different things. Will I
Exactly,
be able
yeah.
to? It could be a haunted house.
It could be a
Could
haunted
I take
house
care of a
with mental
child
illness.
even
Yes.
though I feel like in a good place with my mental health, but would I be in a good place with my mental health with a child? Who knows? Like, there's all these questions
Yeah.
that I think we ask
Exactly.
ourselves.
Mm.
And I think it's okay. Like, I don't know. I don't condemn him.
It's okay to
It
make
is
those
okay.
decisions. I think you're right. It's okay to
Yeah,
make those decisions.
it's what's right for
what's
you.
best for you.
Yeah, parenting is fucking hard. It's the hardest thing in world, if you ask
It's-
me. So it's completely reasonable to have those fears and worries.
Yeah. And I think that's just was a way of like him trying to,
Mhm.
again, it was him closing everything off and control.
Yeah.
Nothing will be bad. No
Control.
one will be hurt if because I'm controlling it. So it was more about
because I'm
other people
yeah.
too. Like, I don't want anyone to be
yeah.
hurt.
Yeah. So maybe it wasn't so harmful. Maybe you've changed.
But what I think is good about it is there are a few tropes and a few potentially harmful things, but they all kind of get resolved mostly at the end. Like they will get subverted in some way, in that, you know, Stephen makes that decision. Dad ends up saving the day at the end. The deadbeat, quote unquote, drug addict ends up being sober, all of those things. In a nice, tidy little bow, which is probably not accurate, but good enough.
Wrap it up in a present.
Yeah. Or are they all dead and this is just a dream? I mean,
That's fine too.
I'll take happy. I'll take
the happy end.
We could probably talk for another hour, let's be honest, but I will let you both go. Before we finish up, could you please let us know anything that's coming up in the pipeline that you'd like to plug, and also give us your details so people can follow you and your podcast?
I have a couple features that are getting theater release. I don't know if it's ever going to make it to Australia or not, but if you're around and you hear the film Hey Victor or the Lebanese Burger Mafia, please go watch them.
Fantastic. I'll find out if it's coming to
They're
Australia.
You can find us at BraaaAAINS AAA podcast on all social.
BRAAAINS podcast.
And this is Sarah. Personally, you can find me for my editing work, Sarah Taylor Editor, on Instagram. That's the best place.
And I'm Heather A. Taylor, everywhere that you can be on social media.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for talking to me about Haunting of Hill House. I hope everyone gets a lot out of our chat, because I feel like we didn't even touch on so many other things, but I felt like it was the rich discussion we were hoping to have. So thank you so much. And please go and listen to Braaains, especially the 3-part episode for Mental Health Awareness Month. Just a brilliant miniseries. And yeah, I haven't listened to your latest episode of Midsummer yet, but because I've been prepping for this, but I'm so excited to listen to it because Midsummer's an amazing
really
film.
good. It's about cults, and we also have one coming up about ghosts.
Yes.
So if you're feeling in the Halloweeny mood, please listen to those. And then, of course, Steph was on the 3-part series. Her episode is doing the best. So it is like, people love it.
Top numbers.
It was, people want to listen and hear, because a lot of people have questions about disclosure. And so I think it's such a fabulous episode. And so we're so grateful again that you joined us, and you were the best person to talk about it. So we really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was such an honor to be on, and it was, a great chat. This podcast is not designed to be therapeutic, prescriptive, or constitute a formal diagnosis for any listener. For a longer version of this disclaimer, please check the episode notes on your podcast app.